It's an honor to introduce Professor Ilan Pappe here tonight, who's a professor, a historian, a public intellectual, an activist, in the most positive meanings of all of these words. Pappe, as you may know, is one of Israel's so-called new historians who, since the release of pertinent British and Israeli government documents in the early 1980s, have been rewriting the history of Israel's creation in 1948 and the corresponding expulsion or flight of more than 700,000 Palestinians in the same year. He has written that the expulsions constituted the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, that they were not decided on an ad hoc basis, as other historians argued, but that they were in accordance with Plan Dalet, drawn up in 1947 by Israel's future leaders. Pappe's work, though, is not simply a recovering of a silenced and oft-forgotten history, but a call to action as well. He is a prolific scholar, but he's also a politically conscious intellectual, whose work and words demonstrate his commitment to human, social, political, and economic justice for all people across Israel, Palestine, and beyond. So it's an absolute pleasure to have him here with us tonight.
Good evening. Thank you, Helga, for your kind introduction. I only watched the second film, unfortunately, and it really epitomized the main message I think I wanted to carry with me this evening in my talk, and maybe it will even impact my talk in a certain way. I demonstrated with the people of Wadi Tine and Wadi Rushmiye against the demolition of their houses before the project of the new roads was completed. And a week ago, when I was in Haifa, I rushed from a meeting in downtown Haifa to Mount Carmel. And without thinking, I used the new road. And I felt very bad after that. But then I sat in my car and I said, but wait a minute, now that you want to go home, you're actually going to take a road that is going through the destroyed village of Balad al-Sheikh in 1948. Okay, so maybe I'll take another route. And then I remembered that route as well goes through another chapter in the demolition of Palestinian villages and houses. And you suddenly realized that this kind of reality that you live in does not really allow you the luxury of finding moral roots back home. They're all immoral. They are all part of a crime that was committed and still is being committed. And I thought about that because academia usually lags behind activism when it comes to Palestine in bringing forth new ideas, new paradigms of how to look at the conflict. But I think in one particular instance, recently, the academic community succeeded in providing us with a certain input or perspective that I think is more helpful than any previous chapter in our attempt as scholars and activists in analyzing the reality in Israel and Palestine. It's not a new paradigm. Usually paradigms are not new. They just sometimes appear in the wrong timing. And when that paradigm that I will talk about tonight appeared for the first time, it did not catch because, for various reasons, for which maybe I'll have time to go into, it did not fit either the Palestinian or the Israeli perspective on the reality. But it resurfaced recently, and I think it's a very acute and a very powerful way of looking at the situation in Israel and Palestine in 2016, and in many ways also answers questions that we want to ask ourselves about the relevance of the Palestine question today to the Middle East and to the world at large. The hegemonic paradigm usually for looking at the situation in Israel and Palestine is one that looks at the conflict as a war between two national movements. And in fact, the peace process, ever since it started, is kind of based on this assumption that you have two national movements fighting for the same piece of land, And when the mediators come from the outside, and especially if they come from this country, they immediately think about a kind of a business problem more than a human problem. And because it's a business problem, immediately you think about partitioning and division and divisibility. You deal with everything that you can cut between the two sides, which is the first principle. And the second principle is you always have to see the balance of power. And you always have to give more to the stronger party, because the stronger party is more important in any attempt to reconcile. Now, of course, the tragedy of this approach is that as the time goes by and this approach is not working, the weaker party becomes weaker, and the stronger party becomes stronger, and therefore the whole idea of peace is to give the stronger party even more than it was offered in the previous attempts of peace. There's also a didactic element to this, or didactic element to this, by saying the weaker party was wrong not to accept a good proposal before, so it should be punished a bit for that and get a bit less. Anyone who's familiar with the posters the Palestinians have about the shrinking of Palestine from 1947 to today would cartographically immediately recognize what I'm talking about. Still, in many universities across this country, this is still the paradigm, and also the solution is based on, therefore, conflict management, conflict resolution, everything that the business schools and schools of international relations and political science are very good at, which has very little relevance to Palestine and Israel, and yet is the hegemonic perspective, both of diplomats, politicians on the one hand, and journalists and academics on the other. Now, I think there's a different paradigm here that should be examined very closely. It would explain to us what's the connection between that what the poor family in Wadi Tine experienced, both in 1948 and both very recently in the beginning of the 21st century. And that paradigm is settler-colonialism, which you should be familiar with in this country as well. Settler-colonialism is very different from colonialism. It's this reality in which people leave or left Europe at different junctures in history because they were persecuted, because they felt unsafe, in fact, because they were under existential threat, and they were looking for safe havens. So in many ways, they left the continent with a one-way ticket, with the notion that they're not going back. And as you know, when they arrived at the new home, they did two things, as they did in this country. One, and the first and the important one, they decided that this was not just a new home, it was also a new homeland. The second thing was to deal with the major obstacle for turning the new home into a new homeland, in their perspective at least, and that was the indigenous population. The logic of settler-colonialist projects from the very beginning was the logic of elimination. As Patrick Wolf, who is one of our most important contributors to this new paradigm and unfortunately passed away 10 days ago, Patrick Wolf is the one who highlighted better than anyone else this logic of elimination. I would add to this another logic, the logic of dehumanization. Victims of persecution in Europe, whether they are Jews or Christians, cannot eliminate another people unless they dehumanize them. And I think this whole project of settler colonialism, through its logic of eliminations, through its logic of dehumanization, despite the fact that it appears in different parts of the world at different historical times, and it has different manifestation, the elimination has different manifestation, is a paradigm that fits very well the story of Zionism and Palestine. Not only when Zionism appeared for the first time in Palestine in 1882, but also today. The two logics that guided the Zionist movement from its very beginning in Palestine are important not just because of the havoc and destruction that they wreaked upon the Palestinians, but also because I think they also impacted or affected or influenced the neighboring Arab societies. We see today a very brutal manifestation of the logic of dehumanization and elimination in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen. And I'm not saying that this logic of elimination and dehumanization that pushed forward the Zionist project is directly responsible for this carnage and destruction of human lives that we are seeing elsewhere. I think the link between the two is not in emulation of a project of elimination by Arabs when they look at Zionism. It is the international legitimacy to the Zionist logic of elimination and dehumanization that is very much part of the carnage, the killing, and dehumanization we see today in Syria in particular, but also other parts of the Middle East, as I've mentioned. That logic of elimination and dehumanization is very important because it also explains to you why the settler community, the Jewish settler community that arrived in Palestine in the late 19th century, can also be preoccupied with amazing projects of humanity. The two are not mutually exclusive. During the first phase of Zionist presence in Palestine, it was the building of an infrastructure of a state out of almost nothing, the creation of a new culture, the integration of hundreds of different immigrant societies and molding them into one society, high tech, and so on. And in the second phase and the third phase, communities emerged with modern art, modern literature, quite a lot of freedom to the individual, as the city of Tel Aviv manifests this kind of energy today. All these developments, all these achievements can be tolerated within a settler-colonialist project. Namely, you can continue to dehumanize, you can continue to eliminate the native population, and yet excel in other aspects of life for the benefit of the settler society. The most important moment, as you have seen in the two films, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, the most important moment in the project of Zionism as a settler-colonialist project was 1948. It took time for the Zionist movement, the leaders of the Zionist movement, to prepare the ethnic cleansing of 1948. They needed, first of all, to map all the Palestinian villages and towns, which they did in the early 1940s. They needed to wait for the right historical moment, and the Holocaust in Europe gave them that historical moment. They needed to wait for the weakening of the British interest and rule in Palestine. And they found the right moment. One should say they found the right moment, although it was not a complete ethnic cleansing. It was, quote unquote, quite a successful ethnic cleansing. Half of Palestine's villages were destroyed. Half of Palestine's towns were demolished. Half of Palestine's population were expelled and became refugees. It is very interesting to read, as our colleague Irene Genzier did in a recent book of her that just came out, I think, a month or two ago, to read the American documents about 1948 and 1949 that are now open to the public. Almost every American representative on the ground, whether they came from the State Department, whether they were part of the CIA infrastructure, or whether they were sent by President Truman, were writing back home to Washington that Israel should be pressured to allow the refugees to return to their homes because the homes are intact, or were intact. And the White House answered back that the Israelis claimed that these people were fleeing or fled and were not expelled. And none of the American representatives on the ground understood the connection between the two. They said, does it matter whether people were expelled, whether they left because they were afraid of the war? Why shouldn't they not have the right to return? If we think about in 2016, can you think about a situation, especially in Europe today, where refugees would come to the Swedish government or the German government and say, we want to go home, and they would not be allowed to go home? This is unthinkable. Even in 1948, it was unthinkable. And something happened as Irene Genzier describes in the book, there was a certain dialectical process happening in 48, 49 that explains to us a lot about American policy today towards Israel and Palestine. Somehow this exceptionalism that would not be accepted anywhere else in the world took place. Namely, at the beginning of 49, people were still, not people, the administration imposed sanctions on Israel for not allowing the Palestinian refugees to return. In the beginning of 1950, it used the Israeli discourse to explain why refugees should not be allowed to return. And when the message from not only the United States, when the message from the international community is that although settler colonialism elsewhere is something of the past, the genociding people, eliminating people, taking over by force someone else's homeland is something that belongs to the period before the Second World War and not after the Second World War. This is the period of decolonization. This is the period that, at least ethically, this is not part of the normative discourse anymore. Despite that, the message to Israel was, you're not included in this conversation. And a lot of great philosophers of morality at that time in Europe, in the 50s and the 60s, could do they could, as today others are doing, and before them Derrida and others were doing. You can adopt universal principles about every place in the world except Israel. Nobody explains this exceptionalism. Nobody builds any logic, infrastructure for this exceptionalism. This exceptionalism is taken for granted. And that exceptionalism was very important for the settler-colonialist project of Zionism in 1948. And the result was that it never stopped since 48 until today. Although a very small number of Palestinians were left within the Jewish state in 1948, Israel allowed itself to impose a harsh military rule on these Palestinians and continued the act of ethnic cleansing. 36 villages were expelled between 1948 and 1956 from within Israel, who were actually already Israeli citizens. They were expelled by force. The international community again developed a kind of a discourse that talked about exceptionalism. And that exceptionalism, again, was a very important message for the Israelis. In 1963, 64, a dramatic change took place in Israeli politics. The great leader of the Zionist movement, David Ben-Gurion, was expelled from political life. He was, surprisingly, given the fact that he was the architect of the ethnic cleansing of 1948, he was the last bulwark in Israel between a lobby of generals and politicians who envisaged a greater Israel as the only ultimate manifestation of the settler-colonialist project of Zionism and the actual implementation of that dream. Until, as long as he was prime minister, all kinds of Israeli plans to occupy the West Bank were rejected by him. But he was removed from politics in 1963. And the Israeli army started seriously contemplating the occupation of the West Bank in 1963, 1964. They already had a military rule in place, which was imposed on the Palestinians and Israel. And they understood that all they had to do was to transfer that military rule into another area of Palestine. They were not interested in the Gaza Strip. They created, and many people don't realize this, Israel created the Gaza Strip. In 1947, there wasn't such a geopolitical entity called the Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip did not exist in 1947. Israel was looking for a space in the southwest of Palestine in order to, so that a space that could contain the hundreds of thousands of refugees it was about to push from the central and south of Palestine into that newly founded huge refugee camp. Gaza was a small town with few fishing villages around it. This is why today in Gaza, most of the people are refugees. So Gaza was already created as a huge refugee camp in 1948. So Israel had no wish to take over that refugee camp. In 1967, they felt that they were tricked by the Egyptians, and they hoped that the Egyptians would take back the Gaza Strip, but also the Egyptians didn't want the Gaza Strip. So they were left with the Gaza Strip. But they wanted the West Bank. They definitely wanted the West Bank. And I think it's very important to understand it, that what we wrongly call the occupation of the West Bank, which is really not the right terminology, what we call the occupation of the West Bank is the colonization of the West Bank. It's another phase in the implementation of the settler-colonialist project of Zionism. It was planned before the 1967 war. Yes, the 1967 war was a very opportune moment that this kind of plan could be exploited. But nonetheless, the urge was there. The lobby was there. If you want to read about a very good description of this pro-Greater Israel lobby before 1967, read Tom Segev's book called 1967. He's a very able journalist. He writes beautifully. And he has a great description there on the powerful lobby in Israel between 1964 to 1967, pressuring the Israeli government to occupy the West Bank. And when Israel occupied the West Bank, and I think this is also very important within the paradigm of settler colonialism, one has to understand that we are talking about a settler colonialist project that is probably only the second one in existence in that moment in time, in the second half of the 20th century. South Africa was still a settler colonialist project in the making. Of course, there are many settler colonial states, including this one. I'm talking about the settler colonialist project as an action, not as a state or a completed project. Now, when the Israeli government, the 13th government of Israel, which was a very unique government, it was a government that included all the political parties that existed within the Zionist spectrum. We never had such a government before. I doubt whether we will have such a government ever after. So every political party was represented in that government, the 13th government of Israel. And they were the people who had to decide what to do with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They had two plans. One was not implemented, which was to move the refugees from Gaza Strip half to the West Bank and half to the Sinai, and hopefully sort of getting rid of the Gaza Strip. This did not work, although they did move refugees around in the Gaza Strip in 67, 68. And the second one was to divide the West Bank to two parts, what the Minister of Labor at the time, Yigal Allon, called the Jewish West Bank and the Palestinian West Bank. What is so exceptional about this situation was, and I don't know if they did it on purpose or this is the you know, the ironic hand of history, they created a peace process that legitimized their ideas of how best to complete the settler-colonialist project of Zionism in Palestine. Namely, you have two problems as a settler-colonialist project if the logic of elimination guides you and the logic of dehumanization. You want to have as few natives in your new homeland as possible, and you want as much of the homeland as possible. Occupying the West Bank ran against this logic, not the geographical logic. You did get more of the homeland. In fact, Israelis were convinced, as Abba Even, the famous Minister of Foreign Affairs, called it, that Israel without the West Bank had what he called the Auschwitz borders. So they were sure that they needed geographically the West Bank. But do we need to incorporate millions of Palestinians? That undermines the logic of elimination, the demographic logic of a settler-colonialist movement. And again, I think it's more the ironic hand of history rather than conspiracy and planning, but we should be aware of this. Suddenly, a new discourse developed in Israel and around Israel. If you were a very efficient settler-colonialist person who understood that actually you don't need to control directly all the area, and you could contain the indigenous native population in enclaves that have no bearing on your democratic system, on your population, which is what the Labour Party in Israel suggested. If you have this kind of idea of how to complete the settler-colonialist project of Zionism, you were part of the Israeli peace camp. In fact, part of these architects received the Nobel Peace Prize for this incredible ideas of how to implement settler-colonialist project in the 20th century. If you were more honest in a way and you said, it doesn't matter, the demographics do not matter, what matters is the geography, because the logic of dehumanization matters, not the logic of elimination. I can include the Palestinians in my new homeland. What does it matter? They won't have rights. They won't be able to vote. They won't be able to be elected. And I could still survive as a successful settler-colonialist project. This was the right wing. Now, the whole peace process that started in '67 was based on this, if you want, more pragmatic, efficient, or what we call in Israel, left ideas of how to implement the settler-colonialist project, with disastrous consequences. Because if a logic of dehumanization and elimination against the Palestinian people is implemented in the name of peace, in the name of reconciliation, in the name of coexistence, it has immunity. And that immunity is won not just because the discourse is so clever, because it also convinces Palestinians to join in. It convinces very conscientious people around the world to join in the moment it's all about peace. It also created another discourse. And again, I don't think it was planned. I think it just emerged. The discourse of temporality. If you are a liberal Zionist, if you are a liberal Jew in America, and as time passes by, you've already been 5 times to the West Bank, you find it difficult to support Israel. But you are being saved by the discourse of temporality. You are being told, don't worry, this is temporary. This will not always be like this. The moment there will be a 2-state solution, the moment there will be peace, this all will end. And people buy into it because people need to solve their cognitive dissonances. But of course, 50 years show you that maybe Israel before '67 was temporary, because it was only 19 years old. Israel with the West Bank is definitely not temporary. This is that. This is it. This is the state of Israel. From the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, there's only one state, and there will always be only one state. It's called the State of Israel. Gaza would have a very unique existence in it, which can only be described in a language of inhumanity, barbarism, and starvation. But I won't talk about Gaza tonight. So we had a lot of energy, diplomatic energy, academic energy, goodwill energy, if you want, invested in supposedly a genuine peace process based on the most sophisticated version of Zionist settler colonialism, which led nowhere. Well, it's not true that it led nowhere. It enabled Israel to deepen the colonization in the West Bank. It enabled Israel to strengthen the fragmentation of the Palestinian reality. So time was not wasted on Israel's side. But we wasted time if we were genuine seekers of peace and reconciliation. We really wasted time. We're still wasting time. We are like the Jewish joke. We keep standing under a huge lamp because we lost the key, but we don't remember where we lost it, so we go where there is light. So we're just standing where the light is, not where the key was lost. And the key was not lost in the two-state solution. It was not lost in the idea of partition. It was not lost in the paradigm of the conflict in Palestine as a war between two national movements. The key is in the darkness of the settler-colonialist reality. Now, for most native people, settler colonialism ended in genocide. And we don't want to see that happening in Palestine, although that's also an option. There are three actually, case studies recently of settler colonialism coming to an end in a more peaceful way. And we should look at these three examples towards the end of this analysis and think about the implication of these processes for a new thinking about Israel and Palestine. And what would it mean for the definition of the Palestinian liberation movement in the future, the definition of the radical anti-Zionist groups in Israel in the future, and the international perception of what is a solution in the future. One example is the north of Ireland, a very long project of settler colonialism. Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland. Protestants were settled there from the 17th century onwards. It took them a long time to find a certain solution. It's not perfect, it's not ideal, but it's a blessing compared to what happened there before. There is the violent and very swift ending of settler colonialism in Zimbabwe, which was based on the idea that no settler colonialist project can come to an end without redistribution of natural resources, especially land. It was done very violently in Zimbabwe. I'm not sure it's a good model. And then we have the South African model, where the settler community was offered a compromise it eventually accepted after years of sanctions and boycott and a very brave struggle by the ANC on the ground. The political apartheid, which was the main means to implement the logic of elimination in the case of the white settlers in South Africa, the political apartheid would come to an end, but in return, the economic apartheid will continue. Also not a very good model, but still, we would rather be in South Africa today than in South Africa under the days of apartheid. So in Palestine and in Israel, we have to think about these models. their weaknesses, their advantages. But of course, just to begin, we need to forsake the kind of language and paradigms which deny a historical fact that Zionism is a settler-colonialist movement. You know, saying about a society that it is settler-colonialist does not mean much. And I thought, when I was part of the group that started to write articles, create journals about it, have courses in universities and conferences about Zionism and settler-colonialism, I thought this would be just the beginning of a conversation. But I was wrong. In my university, I organized a conference called, under the title, Settler-Colonialism in Palestine. And 12 hours later, the Israeli embassy, the Board of Jewish Deputies, even the Prime Minister's office in Britain called my university to say that they would not allow such an anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi conference to take place. We also found out later that neither the Board of Deputies, nor the Israeli ambassador, neither the Prime Minister of Britain knew what settler-colonialism was about. But they were very worried about the connection between colonialism and Israel. Luckily, I'm in a good university, so the conference did take place. But I understood from the reaction that actually probably even the Israelis themselves understand that Israel is a settler-colonialist society. Otherwise, they would not have objected to such an analysis. And this is our task. Can we help from the outside? Can we build from the inside a framework for relationship between the third generation of settlers and the local population? That would require redefining the PLO, which is based on a very different paradigm. The PLO was based on the FLN, the idea that the Zionists are colonialist settlers that could be driven back home. This is not going to happen, ever. We need the ANC as a model, not the FLN. So the Palestinian liberation movement has to redefine its ideas of the project of liberation. Of course, Israeli Jews would be the last one to join in this exercise. You don't leave a comfort zone of a settler just because someone wrote a good article. What you need is a good boycott and divestment and sanction movement to begin and get that into their head. So we should enhance our efforts to strengthen the BDS efforts against Israel. We should ask the Palestinians to lead the way in defining what is the liberation project, also in terms of social justice, not just in terms of political arrangement. Otherwise, we will fall to the same trap as post-apartheid South Africa. For most Israelis, such a conversation would be a conversation that comes from Mars. But it doesn't matter. We have to insist, because we wasted 40 years of talking about nothing, doing nothing, injecting millions into the West Bank that did nothing, creating Palestinian institutions, both in the West Bank and inside Israel, that don't mean nothing, that don't mean anything. So we lost time, we lost energy, and I'm not going to do it. I'm too old. There's a younger generation that understands these issues, both in Israel and in Palestine. And I think they are beginning to build a different discourse. And with this I would end, because the greatest success of Zionism was fragmenting the Palestinians into different groups. And each group had its own agenda. And it was much easier to deal with the Palestine issue. But nobody thought about Facebook when they created the apartheid wall, when they ghettoized Gaza. You can talk in the same moment with people in Gaza, in Hilwe, NYU, Haifa, and Exeter in the morning. With everyone you can talk. And people talk. Young people talk to each other. Young people are thinking in such a way that, in fact, the present political parties, both in Israel and in Palestine, I think, will not be relevant in the near future. The problem is, of course, as we know from neighboring Arab states, that the collapse of existing structure does not mean peace. It can mean chaos, it can mean carnage, it can mean anarchy. But again, because these things have happened before, you have enough knowledge and expertise maybe to prevent them happening elsewhere. So I would end by saying that if in this university you would insist of teaching Israel and Palestine in any course you give on colonialism, on settler colonialism, on apartheid, on genocide, if you will continue to support movements such as the BDS, and if you will have a modicum of conscience in you, and you will not support the policies against the Palestinians, history would judge you as people who have contributed to a better future in Israel and Palestine. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ilan, for that moving talk. We do have time for some questions. I think, do you want to take a few and kind of answer them together?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Whichever.